From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris here on a Tuesday. An interesting show on tap for you today, one that I think I invite you to call and join in the conversation. We're looking at the issue of what's happening in Tennessee state prisons, okay? And we've talked about this on a larger scale, money and what's being spent and resources. Everyone wants to lock everyone up these days. Meantime, no one really wants to pay for it. I mean, every time we do a story, and you know it, you're one of them and I'm one of them, we see something horrible happen and I'm like, yeah, let's catch them. Let's lock them up and let's lose the key, okay, depending on how awful the crime is. And it's real easy to say that, but then on the other side of the coin, it's okay. You start locking up more and more and more people, and I'm not saying a lot of them don't deserve it, but you have to pay for it, more prisons. And if there's any alternative to prisons and a way to safely deal with these individuals, especially nonviolent offenders, I say don't lock them up because I'm tired of paying for them. You know, 3 squares a day, a place to stay, any medical care they need, you know. I don't need that. I don't want to lock people up. All right. So what you have on the large scale is a system where we're trying to lock more people up, but the money and resources aren't there. The Department of Corrections is always battling the budget and has to try to cut back here. We talk about privatization and what's happening. The issue that comes up of late, as you've seen, is inmates maybe getting out of control, inmates sometimes being put at risk, and then, more significantly, the guards and the people working there also put in dangerous situations because they don't have enough money to have enough guards or the proper security in place. I know the Commissioner Schofield for the Department of Corrections would say that's not the case, but I mean, we've seen some very highly publicized incidents where this has happened. Now, what we're going to look at here, and this morning we're going to be joined by our guest who will arrive in just a few moments. He's a Tennessean reporter who did an expose that actually I read, a cover story from a few weeks back about the story of Elbert Thornton. Does that ring a bell with you? Elbert Thornton, an inmate, and what happened to him behind bars. He ended up dying, and the debate, I guess now, is over, was it natural causes or something worse? And we're going to get into it. I want to warn you that some of the subject matter we'll be talking about today is a little bit graphic, and we'll get into it. I want you to listen. And as you sit there considering this story that we're discussing, I don't want to hear any crap from anyone when they say, well, if abuses happen behind bars, that's too bad. These inmates shouldn't have committed the crime to end up behind bars anyway. And I want to remind you, okay, there are standards that have to be met. And I think a civilized society is judged in part on the way it treats not only its disadvantaged, but it's criminals and it's inmates, okay? Being convicted of a crime is something you should be punished for under the law. You do time. That does not mean that inmates or guards or anyone else has a right to torture you or beat you up or harm you behind bars. And too often, I think, when these stories come up, people maybe say, well, yeah, that's bad, but it's an inmate. Who cares? I mean, if he didn't want something like this to happen to him, let's, don't commit the crime, don't go to jail. Right, okay, mistake was made, committed a crime, serving time, but that does not give license to abuses, and I'm very much against it. And we've done stories on it, and it's interesting. Sometimes when we do these stories, I look to see the viewership, and it's not to, it's sometimes I wonder, do people care? And I think a lot of people maybe don't care so much to pay attention to that because of the very reason I said. But on the other hand, just ask yourself, do you know someone who's behind bars? I mean, what if you were behind bars? Not that you would someday. You're law-abiding viewers. I understand that. But, that does not give license to do these types of things. And a lot of questions are raised with the case of Elbert Thornton. This was someone who was classified as dying of a natural death. Talking to others after the autopsy, they said there were stories of beatings, of burnings around his genitals, broken bones. 55-year-old man. I'll get into that more with our guest who is arriving right now. He was caught in traffic. But you know those newspaper reporters. That's just the way they are. He's being mic'd up again. But again, I want to get into this, and I want to open up the phone lines. Your thoughts on the situation involving not just this inmate, and we'll go into some detail on that. But yeah, the big picture, as I said, about the Department of Corrections and whether or not you think there is any type of solution to this. But I want to remind you one more time that some of the topic of conversation about this inmate and what happened to him is kind of graphic this morning, but we're going to get into it for you, and we'll take your phone calls. Again, the number 737-7587. This story, as I said, I remember reading it when it came out, and it was a long one, cover story on the in the Tennessean. That was back in September. A lot has been brought up since, and this came about, by the way, at the same time with everything else that's been looked at in the Department of Corrections and complaints and issues. You've seen the lawmakers talking about it. So let's get into the details now. And enough of me just referring to my notes here. David, is it Boucher?
It's Boucher, you're right. Yep.
David Boucher, good morning to you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us here on the TV side.
Sure.
I'm Nick.
Sure.
And you're with the Tennessean.
That's right.
And I remember when this came out. It was long.
It's still long. Yeah,
it's
a long story.
And are there follow-ups coming?
We'll see.
We'll see. As you looked at it. Well, listen, I know that you did one show with Open Line, and a lot of interest in this. How did you get on this? And let's get into it. The story, Elbert Thornton. Had you decided you were going to look at some of the complaints that were coming out of the Department of Corrections?
Yeah, that's right. As I'm sure you know, as a fellow reporter who's covered similar topics, when you know you're onto an interesting story or a story with more leads once you do one story, and you get a ton of calls, you get a lot of letters and emails, and so that's kind of what happened here. We had done some reporting just in general on some of the issues that were going on in the Tennessee prison system, and
a lot of them.
Yeah, and as you said, there's quite a few, and I got a couple of tips and kind of followed up on it. As you know, sometimes they pan out, sometimes they don't, and in this case, clearly there was something that was worth reporting.
Yeah, you really hit on one here, because just like in your newsroom and ours, we get a lot of calls from families of inmates and complaining about this, complaining about that. And I'll be honest with you, I'd say at least 75% of them are just parents that are being told something and they're worried about their child who committed a crime, and it's nothing. It really is. You look into it, and it's like, sorry, they're in prison. They're not going to get the food they want to eat or whatever like that. But this one, as I read it, I was like, wow, there is something here. You have to sift through them. What was it that initially, because I mean, when you first make the calls, you're hearing from Department of Corrections, this individual died of natural causes. We've had an autopsy. We've looked into this, natural causes. What made you go beyond?
So we had, as you know, the process is, we get a tip and we start to look into it. And I think as a reporter, when you really start to delve in is when the documents match up with what you're hearing from sources. And so what really kind of tipped us off to this story is when we saw the medical examiner's report that didn't list the cause of death as a natural death. And when we saw the coroner's report that said that this death was suspicious, that's obviously when we really started to push forward with this story.
What was it that the Department of Corrections said they could not release to you? Like, were there medical records from within the
That's
department?
right. Every inmate and anybody just within the system have their medical records for, if they have a heart condition or if they have anything else going on. They have told us that they can't release those records to us because of HIPAA, the Federal Privacy Act.
Even to the family members, I've heard.
That's what they're trying to argue. We think that that's incorrect. We think that as the next of kin or as a person who has the power of attorney, that they need to that they are required to turn that over to the family. We've been told by the family's attorney that the state is willing to turn over some documentation. I'm not sure exactly what documentation, as long as they sign an agreement that they won't release that documentation to anybody else.
Interesting. I always found that whole thing nutty anyway. I understand HIPAA.
Sure.
Okay, which makes a headache for us in our biz.
Absolutely.
It used to be great. But I understand the privacy issue. Once you're dead, I'm dead, you want my medical records, have them. I mean, that's my take. Now, is there litigation involved with this?
There is. The family, Mr. Thornton's daughter, is working with a local attorney here in Nashville. The case was filed, the wrongful death suit was filed in federal court. It's been moved over kind of to like a regulatory state court, but they're obviously seeking damages for wrongful death.
Okay, so if we can, and as I said, it's a long story, but if you can kind of capsulize it for our viewers a little bit about what it is you discovered, the state story of his death,
sure,
and then some of the nature of his injuries and what you found through some of your other investigations.
Sure. So Mr. Thornton was an inmate at West State Tennessee Prison Penitentiary. Excuse me. It's in Henning, which is just outside of Memphis.
Yeah.
And he was found, according to the state, he was found by his cellmate on the morning of June 12th, 2013. Taken to the local hospital where he was pronounced dead state records from the prison system say that his death was listed as a natural death.
55-year-old guy.
Right.
Had been serving about how long?
He'd been in, I think, since he'd been in about 10 years.
Okay,
I believe.
He was in there, by the way, for facilitation of murder, was it? Or?
Yeah, he was convicted of driving the car away from an attempted robbery where someone was shot and killed.
Okay. And serving 18 years.
That's right. And he was coming up for parole soon. He was eligible for parole, and in theory could be getting out. The next time he saw
not
the
the
parole
trigger
board.
man, but yes, accomplice to it. Okay.
And he'd been in jail, in prison, as we talked about, for some time.
Okay.
The state again said that they found him with his cellmate. His cellmate was trying to perform life-saving measures to revive him. Well, obviously wasn't successful, taken to the hospital where he was pronounced dead, according to the state. However, the medical examiner's report found that instead of him dying of natural causes, they couldn't determine the cause of death. And there's a distinction here between the cause of death and the manner of death. And that was kind of the issue here.
Yeah.
And the manner of death that they determined here was multiple blunt, traumatic, and thermal injuries.
Oh, okay.
And so that's kind of what, as you talked about, tip us off.
How's that natural?
And that's kind of what we asked the department. We said that doesn't make any sense. And the department has they've kind of hinted that, one, they can't release the records, but if you saw his medical records, you might be able to see that. As you noted earlier, there were burn marks on the body. They suggested that maybe he had spilled some hot water on himself. The nature of those burn marks would, according to an expert we talked to, seem to make that unlikely. But I think this quote is interesting from a spokeswoman from the department. They said, "If I had blunt force trauma, you would assume I was beat up, but I could have fallen out of bed." We had an independent medical examiner look at it and say that that's just highly unlikely that these injuries happened from somebody falling out of bed. You mentioned a couple of them earlier, but there were marks across his chest and his back that one of the initial doctors described as whip marks, and that's kind of what tipped off some of the doctors initially to move forward with an autopsy.
And could these marks have been sustained over a period of time, or do you think this was all one intense moment that led to his death? Or are you suggesting that this guy's been whipped and beaten, and maybe this was the last straw, the final beating that killed him?
So according to this independent medical expert, he's a medical examiner in New Jersey who reviewed the case for us. He said that there are injuries that were both new and healing, and so that seems to indicate that something happened to this man over a series of events. That this all didn't just happen at one time.
And after he died, his body, I guess their investigations, was the family then able to get the body for an autopsy and then to have their own burial?
Well, the Lauderdale.
How does that work?
Anytime an inmate dies in prison, we've been told that they request an autopsy, that an autopsy is performed.
Okay.
So Lauderdale County, who's out there, the medical examiner's office, they're the ones who did the autopsy, and that took some time. I'm not sure about the exact logistics of when the family was able to get the body and move forward with the funeral.
But they did. But the family got eventually. I mean, did his loved ones get to see his body and see, oh my gosh, look at the whip marks?
I'm not sure. I don't know if that's actually happened. I do know that his daughter became obsessed with the medical examiner's report when she got it. She said she read it, she couldn't put it down, and it was something that, understandably, if you read it, you can understand where she's coming from. It just was kind of seared into her mind, and that's something that she just continued to harp on and just read and just sort of solidify this belief that her father didn't die a natural death.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to take some phone calls. I want to get more into it to set the table more for you, but if you have questions or comments, you see the number on the screen, 737-7587. If you're on hold, Greg and others, stay there. We'll get to you. More of our conversation with the Tennessean reporter who did this fine piece right after this. Stay with us.